Now, I want to tell you about a girl named Grace Porter and about the summer day that changed everything she thought she knew about kindness. Heat pressed through the warped glass of Cedar Falls' only church like a hand laid flat against a chest. June dust hung suspended in slanted light, golden and thick, almost beautiful if you didn't have to breathe it. Wildflowers wilted against the altar rail, their petals curling inward as if the heat had taught them to give up early. Pine pews radiated warmth stored from 100 summer Sundays, and the whole building smelled of tallow candles and old wood and something close to prayer. Grace stood in the doorway wearing her mother's altered dress. The lace at her wrists had yellowed, and the hem showed where it had been taken up twice. She was 19 years old, and her father stood beside her with his hand on her elbow and his eyes fixed on the floorboards. He would not look at her, had not looked at her properly since the night he told her what he'd done, his voice flat as a dealt card. His fingers turning his whiskey glass round and round on the kitchen table, while the words fell out of him like coins he'd already spent. The congregation watched. A man in the third pew studied his boots as if the leather held scripture. A woman adjusted her glove, finger by finger, her gaze sliding past Grace the way water slides past a stone it doesn't want to touch. The preacher glanced toward the door, just once. The way a man looks for rescue he knows ain't comin'. At the altar, Ethan Dawson waited. He was not what she expected. Not drunk, not cruel-eyed, not old. He was perhaps 30. Weathered the way men get when the land works them harder than they work it. His shirt was clean, pressed with visible care, and his boots were brushed through the leather had cracked years ago. He stood still the way a fence post stands still, not from ease, but from practice. The preacher spoke. Grace's voice came out thin as creek water in August. Ethan's came low and certain, like he'd thought about every word before he gave it. When it came time, he took her hand. His palm was rough, calloused across the heel and fingers, but he didn't grip. He held, the way you hold something you don't want to break. Grace noticed the difference before she understood it. The ceremony was brief. The church door swung shut behind them with a sound like a book closing, and Grace stepped into white sunlight so bright it burned the tears right off her lashes. Ethan walked beside her, not touching, not pulling. "The wagon's this way, ma'am," he said. "If you're ready." She wasn't, but she went. The barn and the bed. The cabin was small. 2 rooms, a stove, a porch that leaned slightly east as if it had been listening for wind its whole life. Clean, though. That was the first thing Ethan wanted her to know without saying it, that he'd scrubbed the floors, beaten the dust from the curtains, laid fresh straw in the mattress. He set her bag inside the bedroom door. Then he took his blanket from the bed, folded it under his arm, and turned toward the yard. "I'll be out there," he said. "You need anything? The lamp's on the shelf." Grace opened her mouth, closed it. He was already crossing the yard, his boots raising small clouds that caught the last copper light of evening. She stood alone in a stranger's bedroom. The quilt smelled of lye soap and cedar. A wooden cross hung above the headboard, his wife's. She guessed. Sarah. The woman who died on the trail west 3 years ago, leaving Ethan with a 4-year-old boy and a grief so deep it had turned his voice to gravel and his kindness to something he did quietly, like a man praying where nobody could see. He didn't marry you to own you, Grace told herself, but she couldn't yet say what he married her for. In the barn, Ethan lay on his back, staring at the rafters. The hay smelled sweet and dry and reminded him of the night before Sarah passed, when they'd camped beside a meadow and she'd said the grass smelled like home, even though they hadn't found one yet. 3 years of setting 2 places at a table meant for 3. 3 years of Tommy asking questions that had no good answers. Ethan hadn't gone looking for a wife. He'd gone to the bank about his note, and the banker mentioned Porter's debts, and the girl with no mother alive, and a father who'd gambled away her future along with his own. He knew what it looked like. He'd caught his reflection in the general store window that morning and straightened his collar, the gesture of a man who cared more than he'd ever admit about what the world saw when it looked at him. Come dawn, he was at the stove, flour on his hands, coffee just past boiling. Grace appeared in the doorway, still wearing yesterday's dress, her hair loose, her eyes wide, as if she'd walked into the wrong house. "Mornin'," Ethan said. He wiped his hands on a cloth. "What would you like for breakfast, ma'am?" She stared at him. The question hung between them like it had never been asked of her before. Maybe it hadn't. "Eggs," she said, quiet. "If you have them." Ethan nodded, cracked 2 into the pan. The silence between them held no anger. It held something else entirely, something neither of them had a name for yet. The boy at the door, Tommy, was 7 years old, brown-haired, serious as a sermon. He had his father's jaw and his mother's eyes, and he watched Grace from doorways the way a barn cat watches a stranger still, unblinking, ready to bolt. That first week, Grace learned his rhythms by learning his distances. He rose when Ethan rose, ate what was set before him. At supper, he pulled out Grace's chair because his father had told him to, but his hands dropped the instant the duty was done. When Grace passed the cornbread, Tommy reached for it without touching her fingers, his arm drawing a careful arc around the space where her hand had been. One morning, she found him in the yard and said good morning. Tommy walked the long way around the well to avoid passing within arm's reach of her. Not running, not rude, just a boy who had drawn a line in the dirt that only he could see. "You treat her with the same respect you'd give your mama," Ethan told him the 3rd morning, kneeling to the boy's level beside the porch step. His voice was gentle, but it carried iron underneath, the way good fences carry wire inside the wood. "You hear me, son?" "Yes, sir." Tommy obeyed, in body, his heart. Though his heart stayed locked tighter than a winter root cellar, Grace didn't push. She swept, mended, learned the stove's bad temper on the left side. She hung washing and carried water, and tried to make herself useful enough to earn the space she occupied. One afternoon, kneeling by the porch to pull a weed, she spotted it tucked beneath the bottom step, wrapped in a scrap of faded calico. A small horse carved from pine. The knife marks were delicate, patient. A woman's hand had made this. Grace's fingers hovered over the wood, She could feel the love still holden to it, the way warmth holds to a stone after sunset. She pulled her hand back, didn't touch it, respected the boundary of a 7-year-old's grief without being asked. That night, she closed the cabin door and turned the latch not against Ethan, not against anything outside. She turned it the way a woman turns a page, choosing to stay on this one a little longer, choosing to see what the next line said. Small kindnesses, measured in inches now. Here's what nobody in Cedar Falls understood about Ethan Dawson. They saw the patched roof and the thin cattle and the shirt washed so many times the collar had gone soft as chamois. They saw poor. What they didn't see was the way that man paid attention. He noticed Grace had 3 books dog-eared, spine cracked, read so many times the pages had gone soft at the corners. He didn't say a word about it. But one Tuesday, while she was hauling water from the creek, he cut 2 oak planks, sanded them smooth, and nailed a shelf above the window where the morning light came strongest. When Grace came back and saw it, her hand went to her mouth. She stood there a full 5 seconds. Fingertips pressed to her lips, her eyes bright. Ethan was already walking toward the barn, his toolbox under his arm, like he'd done nothing more remarkable than fix a hinge. The weeks built on small things like that. Grace sewed curtains from flour sacks, hemmed neat as Sunday gloves. She planted sage and rosemary beside the step. She learned which burner heated fast and which one took patience. And she gave each its rightful due. Ethan mended the porch rail, oiled the cabin door so it swung without complaint, built a proper chicken run so she wouldn't have to chase the hens come feedin' time. They spoke in actions because the words hadn't arrived yet. Their grammar was carpentry and cornbread and coffee left where the other would find it still warm. At the general store one Saturday, the whispers found them. Grace was reaching for a spool of thread when she heard Mrs. Hadley lean toward Mrs. Pike, her voice sweet as poisoned honey. "That's the Porter girl. Her daddy practically sold her off, for the price of his note at the bank. I heard." Grace's fingers froze on the thread. 3 paces behind her, Ethan's jaw tightened like braided leather. He said nothing. Not because he lacked the words, but because he knew any defense he offered would only make the gossip taste sweeter to the ones who fed on it. They rode home in silence. Tommy sat between them, kicking his boots against the wagon board, feeling the quiet the way children feel weather, knowing something had changed without understanding what. That evening on the porch, Grace brought Ethan his coffee. Their fingers brushed on the tin cup and neither pulled away. Grace smiled just barely, just the corner of her mouth lifting, and Ethan looked down at his hands, looked away too quickly, the way a man looks away from a fire when he's afraid of how much he needs the warmth. The crickets sang the conversation they couldn't. What silence teaches 5 weeks in, and Grace made a discovery that changed everything between her and Tommy, though you wouldn't have known it to look at them. She was mending the boy's shirt by lamplight, the needle catching the flame's reflection with each pull, when she noticed the stitch pattern along the inside seam. Small, careful, looped at the ends in a way no tailor would bother with. A mother's signature, written in thread. Sarah had mended this shirt maybe sitting in this very chair, maybe by this same kind of light, and her hand had left something behind that was more than repair. Grace studied the pattern, then she matched it, loop for loop, spacing exact, the needle following a path laid down by a woman she would never meet, but was beginning to understand in the language they shared, the language of caring for the same people. Next morning, Tommy picked up the shirt from the back of his chair. He turned it over in his hands, and his thumb traced the mending the way you'd trace a familiar road on a map. His fingers stopped moving. He looked at the stitching a long time. Then he pulled the shirt on without a word. But he didn't leave the kitchen. He sat at the table while Grace cooked, his feet swinging above the floor. And he stayed. 3 days later, Grace found a wildflower on the kitchen table, a small purple thing, its stem wrapped in a damp leaf to keep it living. No one in the room, no explanation offered or expected. Grace didn't say a word. She set it in a tin cup with water and placed it on the windowsill where the morning light would find it. When Tommy came in for supper, his eyes went to the sill first. The flower was there, lit gold from behind. He looked at Grace. She looked at him. 1 full second of something that wasn't trust yet, but was the door trust would eventually walk through. A week passed. A blue jay feather appeared on her chair, then a smooth creakstone on the windowsill beside the flower's replacement. Tommy showed her which hen laid first in the morning. And then, standing by the chicken run with his hands shoved in his pockets, he said the first real words he'd ever chosen to give her. "That brown one's name is Mabel. Mama named her." Grace knelt to his level. "Mabel's a fine name," she said. Tommy nodded, kicked a pebble, walked away. But the distance between them had changed, and they both knew it. Evenings on the porch grew longer, Ethan beside Grace, coffee cooling in both their hands, silence easy between them now, their chairs an inch closer than the week before. That night, lying in the dark, Grace thought the word home. It rose unbidden, like steam from a cup. She caught herself, felt the old fear prickle along her ribs. Then she let the word stay, let it settle into the quiet, let it breathe. The women of Cedar Falls. The church social fell on the first Sunday in August, and Grace dressed for it like a woman dressing for battle, though she didn't know it yet. She wore the blue calico she'd re-sewn with a fitted waist and fresh white collar cut from the one good piece of cloth Ethan had brought home without being asked. She looked good, for the first time in weeks. She felt brave enough to look good. And the feeling carried her across the churchyard with her shoulders squared and her chin steady. The quilting circle sat beneath the oak beside the parish hall. 8 women, needles busy, voices busier. Grace approached with her hands clasped and her pulse beaten at her wrists like a bird against glass. Mrs. Hadley looked up first. Her smile came too quick and landed wrong, the way a painted sign sits crooked on an honest building. "Why, Grace, we didn't think you'd want to." "Well, you're welcome to sit, of course." Mrs. Pike shifted her chair a half-inch closer to Mrs. Hadley. The gap she left wasn't large enough to mean anything. It was large enough to mean everything. "She seems like a nice enough girl, Margaret," said old Mrs. Calloway from the far end, her voice uncertain, her needle still moving. "I don't see the harm in—" "Nobody said there was any harm, Louise." Mrs. Hadley's smile didn't waver. "I said she's welcome." A younger woman, the banker's wife, leaned to her neighbor without lowering her voice a single degree. "The girl who was sold. That's what my Henry calls it. Says Porter signed the paper right there in his office. Like a bill of sale." The needles kept moving. The silence around those needles said everything the mouths pretended not to. Grace's hands went still at her sides. She understood then. With the kind of clarity that arrives like cold water, she wasn't excluded for anything she'd done. She was excluded for what had been done to her. The shame wasn't hers. It was her father's. But the town had pinned it to her chest like a scarlet ribbon, and these women intended to make sure it stayed. Tommy stood at the edge of the churchyard watching, his small fists clenched at his sides, knuckles white as milk teeth. Ethan noticed the boy's fury before he noticed his own. Grace retreated to the wagon. She sat very still, back straight, eyes fixed on a point beyond the tree line where the sky didn't know about quilting circles or whispered judgments or girls whose fathers traded them for the price of a debt. Ethan found her there, said nothing, sat beside her on the wagon bench, close enough that his shoulder touched hers. After a long moment, he pulled his handkerchief from his vest pocket and placed it in her lap. She pressed it to her eyes and let herself be small for 1 minute. Just one. "I wish I could tell you that was the hardest Sunday." But there was one more coming, and this time, it wouldn't be the women who spoke loudest. The longest night in the barn. Ethan couldn't sleep. He lay on his back in the barn with the blanket pulled to his chest and the dark pressed close as a second skin. And the church social played behind his eyes like a fire that wouldn't bank. He'd seen Grace's face when she walked back from the quilting circle. She hadn't cried in front of anyone. She'd cried later, alone in the bedroom, when she thought the walls were thick enough to hold it. But sound carries through pine boards the way truth carries through silence. And Ethan heard every breath she tried to swallow. Each one landed on him like a stone dropped in still water, the ripples spreading wider than the sound. Did I do this to her? The question sat on his chest, heavier than the dark. He'd married her to spare her from drowning. But maybe all he'd done was hand her a different kind of water to drown in his poverty, his grief. A town that saw a transaction where he'd meant a promise. He thought about the annulment papers the circuit judge could draw up, about scraping together enough for a train ticket east. He could set her free, send her somewhere the whispers couldn't follow, somewhere she could be 19 and unburdened and not the wife of a man the whole county pitied. By morning, the thought hadn't left. But something else arrived beside it. Through the kitchen window, Ethan saw them, Tommy and Grace, side by side at the table, the boy showing her how to braid a rope halter. His small hands guided hers, adjusting her fingers on the strands, and his voice carried through the glass, clear as bird song. Not just words, laughter, the sound of a boy who had forgotten, for one unguarded minute, that the world had taken his mother away. Tommy was laughing. The sound hit Ethan so hard, his hand found the door frame, and his fingers gripped the wood until the grain pressed white lines into his skin. His boy hadn't laughed like that since Sarah. Not once in 3 years. He couldn't let go. Not of the door frame. Not of them. That evening, Ethan rolled up his blanket and carried it to the cabin. He stood in the main room with his hat in his hands, turning the brim the way his own father used to when searching for the right words in the wrong light. "I was wondering," he said, not quite looking at her, "if you'd mind me sleeping inside, on the floor, out here." He cleared his throat. "I figure a man who sleeps in his own barn long enough starts thinking like the horses, and I reckon I'd rather think like a man who belongs somewhere." Grace looked at him. Her eyes were steady. The lamp caught something moving behind them. Not pity, not obligation. Something that looked, if you caught it at the right angle, like the beginning of a choice being made. She nodded. He spread the blanket by the stove. The cabin settled around them, 2 people breathing in the same room, the fire clicking low, the dark outside pressing gentle against windows that held. Here's what Ethan never said aloud, not to Grace, not to Tommy, not to anyone. He wasn't afraid of the town. He wasn't afraid of poverty or gossip or being judged by folks who'd never missed a meal in their lives. He was afraid he'd love her and that she'd leave, and he'd be alone again, but worse this time, because now he'd know the exact shape of what he lost. His hand pressed flat against his chest in the dark. Just once, as if checking whether something still worked in there. It did. The pew and the promise. Autumn came to Cedar Falls the way mercy comes to a tired heart slowly. Then, all at once, the maples turned gold overnight. The air thinned and sweetened. Dust that had choked the summer settled into the earth like an old argument finally laid to rest. They walked to church together that Sunday morning, Ethan in his clean shirt, collar pressed sharp, Tommy with his hair combed and parted, water still dark at his temples, Grace wearing a sage green dress she'd sewn herself from cloth she'd chosen with her own hands, her back straight, her chin level with the horizon line. They sat together in the 5th pew. A family. Anyone with honest eyes could see it. The whispers started before the hymn book opened. Mrs. Hadley leaned toward Mrs. Pike. Her voice carried the way voices carry in wooden buildings, bouncing off pews and rafters and landing exactly where they shouldn't. Poor thing. The girl who was sold. I heard her father still hasn't shown his face. Grace's fingers tightened on the hymnal until the leather creased beneath her knuckles. Ethan's jaw worked once, a slow grinding motion, his eyes fixed straight ahead. The preacher's voice faded to a distant hum, a sound no more meaningful than wind against clapboard. Tommy's spine went straight as a lodgepole pine. What happened next, well, I still get a lump telling it. The boy stood up on the pew, both boots planted on the polished wood, the soles leaving faint dust prints that the deacon's wife would later refuse to wipe away. His head rose suddenly above every bonnet and hat brim in the building. Every face turned. The preacher stopped mid-sentence. his mouth open around a word that never arrived. Mrs. Hadley's lips parted with the whisper still caught between her teeth. Tommy looked at them, every single one. His mother's eyes swept that congregation, the way lamplight sweeps a dark room, finding every corner, leaving nothing hidden. The dust motes hung frozen in the colored light from the window, suspended, holding still as if even the air wanted to hear what this child had to say. My pa didn't buy her. His voice was clear, small, yes. 7 years old, yes. But clear the way creek water is clear when you can see straight down to the stones at the bottom. He promised to take care of her. That's what good men do. The church went silent. Not the uncomfortable silence of people waiting for something to pass. The deep silence. The kind that falls when something true has been spoken, and every soul in the room knows it. A woman in the second row pressed her hand to her throat. The banker lowered his eyes to his knees. Mrs. Hadley's needle-sharp face went soft around the edges. Just for a moment, like a fence post after years of rain. Grace looked at Ethan. His jaw was set hard, the muscle working beneath the skin. But his eyes were wet. The tears didn't fall. They held. The way a river holds at its bank before deciding which way to turn. She reached for his hand. He took it. His rough palm closed around her fingers, and she felt everything in his grip, the grief, the work, the loneliness, the steady, unbroken promise he'd made at this very altar 3 months and a lifetime ago. They walked out through the church doors. The doors swung outward this time, into autumn light that fell across their shoulders like a blessing nobody had thought to ask for. Tommy walked between them. Grace's hand stayed in Ethan's. Ours autumn painted the valley in colors that had no use for words. Gold in the cottonwoods, copper in the scrub oak. The sky a blue so deep and clean it looked like someone had washed it overnight and hung it out to dry. Grace sat on the porch in late afternoon light, Tommy asleep against her shoulder. His breath came warm and even through the cotton of her dress, and his weight was solid against her side, the particular weight of trust that has been earned one wildflower, one feather, one brown hen named Mabel at a time. In the yard, Ethan worked the fence line, not because the fence was broken, it held fine, but building was how Ethan Dawson spoke when his heart ran past what his words could carry, and lately his heart had been running further than it had in years. Grace watched his hands move, the same hands that held hers at the altar when she was trembling. The same hands that cracked eggs at dawn and built shelves for books nobody else thought mattered, and gripped a doorframe the morning he heard his boy laugh again. She understood him now. Not the way stories pretend all at once, in a flash of sudden knowing. She understood him the way you come to understand weather, by living inside it long enough to read what the sky means before it speaks. He had married her because he recognized something. The same loneliness, the same silence in a room full of people who won't meet your eyes. He'd stood in that silence himself for 3 years. And when he saw it settling over a 19-year-old girl whose own father wouldn't look at her, something inside him, something deeper than reason, older than calculation, said no, said not her too, said I know what that feels like. and I will not stand by and watch. Light slanted through the open cabin door, golden, warm, thick with flour dust from the bread she'd baked that morning. The same quality of light that had filled the church on her wedding day. But that light had caught dust and fear and the smell of wilting flowers. This light caught flour and rosemary and the scent of a home where somebody was always making something, always tending something, always choosing to be here. Grace looked at the cabin. Ethan's tools hung on the porch rail. Her herbs grew thick beside the step. Tommy's drawings were tacked to the kitchen wall beside the carved pine horse, both honored, side by side, neither one replacing the other. She stopped calling it his cabin. She called it ours. The word came easy, like breathing, like the most natural thing she had ever done. The door stood open. Lamplight reached across the porch boards into autumn dusk, spilling toward the yard where Ethan set down his hammer and looked back at her. He didn't smile. Ethan Dawson wasn't much for smiling, but his eyes held something better, something steadier. The look of a man who had finally stopped waiting for the thing he loved to leave. 3 shadows stretched long across the golden dirt. Where they met, they merged into one shape, a family, held together not by debt or duty or the arrangements of desperate men, but by breakfast questions and borrowed stitches, and one brave boy who stood on a church pew and told the truth loud enough to silence every whisper in the room. And that, I believe, is what good men do. They don't buy futures. They build them one quiet morning, one honest promise, one small voice at a time.